One of my favorite Bible verses, one I shared with this congregation when they blessed me on the path to discernment for ordination, comes out of Deuteronomy 30. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. The writer of Deuteronomy goes on to implore, so choose life. When this passage first caught fire in me, I was 22 years old. I had been through a time of depression, a time of dark spiritual struggle. The faith of my childhood was not enough to hold me in that moment. It was not enough to contain the pain and grief that life had brought to me. But I had been coming out of the pit when I came across this passage, and wow, did it grab me. I wanted to choose life in every moment. I wanted to live. I wanted that to be the guiding principle of my life, and I still do. It still touches me, and it's why I shared it with the congregation a couple months ago. The problem is, how often are we faced with only two options in life? An option that is clearly life, and an option that is clearly death. How often do we have enough information and enough foresight into the future to know when a decision offers either death or life? That is what moral stress is. Moral stress is what we carry when our values come into conflict with each other. And moral stress can vary in degree. It can be minor, nagging, something we just accept as part of life, or it can be major, heart-wrenching, something that demands to be addressed. A couple of examples. Stacy has read about how department stores outsource the making of their clothes because labor is cheaper in Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh. She also knows that the working conditions are often not as safe in other countries because they don't have as many regulations as the US has. In fact, that's why the clothes are cheaper. However, Stacy doesn't feel like she has enough money to have much of a choice on where she shops. She tells herself she won't shop at one store that she's heard to be the worst of them all, but instead she will only shop at a different store. But Stacy knows it might not be much better there. But what else can she do? Max joined the military to pay for college, but also to be a part of something bigger than himself. He served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. When he was home, he went to church, eager to find another community in which he belonged. He soon noticed that the others at church grew uneasy when he told them that he had served in the military. And the pastor had even spoken against military efforts in her sermon. Max wasn't sure how he felt about his service in the first place, but now he felt as if he didn't even belong in this community. A voter was sitting with her midterm election ballot, and it was time for her to make final choices about propositions that seemed to put good things at odds with each other, if either side of the argument were to be believed. Education, economic development, women's rights, justice. How would she vote in a way that honored her different values and commitments? Each of these people are carrying moral stress in their everyday lives. They are not just isolated moments of ethical dilemma. They are moments where we might say that the rubber meets the road, and we are called to act. And yet, we cannot always act in a way that seems to absolve us from the feeling that we disappointed ourselves somehow. Moral stress is often experienced through the emotions of guilt, shame. I feel guilty I was unable to live out that value I hold. I feel ashamed that I believe one thing, and sometimes I feel like I have to choose another. But how are we to hold such moral stress? If we are to feel it, what are we supposed to do with it? That's the question. Do we try to get rid of it? Or rather, is it a good thing to feel this moral stress? In Christian tradition, we have other names for moral stress. We've called it sin. We've called it conviction. How many of you bristle at such words? Many of us have been a part of communities in which we were called to live in these emotions of shame and guilt, seemingly permanently, because it was called sin, and because there was nothing we could do to overcome it. Or else we were in traditions that focused on activities and actions as sinful that maybe we later decided weren't that sinful. I myself went to a largely evangelical Christian university for my undergraduate studies. I had a theology professor once pose this question to us, a room of very evangelical young people. What if God cares about more than whether you have sex before you're married? What if God cares more about how you treat people, how your actions liberated or oppressed people? There was silence in the room as we let that sink in. It was the opposite of what we had heard before. We later read a book by process theologian Marjorie Suhaki, who framed sin as, quote, the unnecessary violation of the well-being of any aspect of creation. The unnecessary violation of the well-being of any aspect of creation. She also believed that as people, we are caught up in systems that sometimes violate others' well-being, and our involvement in these systems necessarily implicates us in the sin. For example, for Suhaki, Westerners are all implicated in the sins of production and consumption, the sins of our clothes and goods coming at the expense of another's well-being. Suhaki later wrote, "To name something as sin is to say, this ought not be the case." But if we don't talk about sin, or moral stress, or whatever you want to call it, we lose accountability to ourselves and to each other. We're called to be bringers of justice, and that means we have to deal with the ways that we fall short of such an ideal. We feel moral stress because we do things we know are not good, but we also feel our human limits. The disciples, on the night Jesus was praying in the garden, kept falling asleep. Jesus told them, "Hey, stay awake." And still, they would fall asleep. I can imagine they didn't feel good about that, and yet they were pressed up against their human limits. We have human limits, and when we push up against those, we do things that we're not proud of. We contribute to decisions and to systems that Suhaki said, we know this ought not be the case. We ought not have to choose between the lesser of two evils, and yet, how often does this phrase get used? Because we understand that we all have moments that leave us stuck. So how can we bear this? How can we not get lost in the hopelessness of it all, in the finitude of our humanity, and the finitude of our decisions, of what we can do, of the choices even set before us? What do we do when the choices we have to make is not something between death and life, but between death and death, or life and life, or something in between both of those? Meh and meh. One, we acknowledge it. We name it. As Suhaki reframed sin for us, as Suhaki challenged us to name what falls short of what it could be as sin, we name it. We acknowledge it. The psalmist said, "When I kept silence, my body wasted away. And then I acknowledged my sin." We notice when we feel sin and guilt, we accept that as a part of human experience. But how do you notice these feelings? We have to be in touch with ourselves. We have to feel it. Sometimes we feel it in our bodies. We feel the heaviness on us. We feel the pit of our stomach drop at choices we don't want to make. And it takes honesty. When we feel like physically retreating, when we feel like running away from these things, we have to name it. We have to name it, we hold it, and we hold it with compassion for ourselves, knowing our human limits, even while we live in a complex world. Secondly, we name it in community with others. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote that the value in confession is that we struggle to experience the fullness of God's love and grace except through our relationship with others. When we are able to name the moral stress we are feeling in our lives, when we are able to name what we feel as if we are falling short, and still be received in love by another person, we get a glimpse of the enduring love of God. This helps us in holding ourselves in compassion and grace when we feel that compassion and grace from someone else. Thirdly, we have to be able to hold each other in a delicate place of acceptance and grace without denying that things are not always the way they ought to be. Many of us are rightfully skittish about being with others when they're feeling the negative emotion of guilt. We want to absolve them. We want to take it away. Don't feel guilty. It's okay. You don't have to feel guilty. However, guilt can be a motivating emotion. If I say something callous or insensitive to my partner, and I immediately feel a pang of guilt because I may have just caused pain to someone I love, I can recognize what has happened and try to do better. If I shared this story with someone in my community and they absolved my guilt without letting me feel the conviction and motivation to do better, then something in the process would be lost. However, other people who love and care for us can also prevent us from feeling such despair over the moments we are not at our best. It is a delicate balance, to be sure, one we must learn together as a community of faith. Lastly, we seek ways to both hold the moral stress and to transform the moral stress as we seek to live lives more full of integration. Hopefully, we continue to search for ways to let our committed values manifest more richly in our lives, minimizing the ways we act counter to them. In the example of Stacy and shopping for her clothes, there may be other options that mediate the stress she feels over being caught in the system. She may discover that there are affordable alternatives that enact her values. The voter in our example may find that through dialogue and relationship, she is able to make a decision in the short term over how to vote, but maybe she commits herself to some other alternative social action in the future that can better address her own ambivalence with the limited options she felt she was given. So what are you carrying moral stress over? Where do your actions conflict with your values? In a moment, we're going to give you a chance to name these places of moral stress in your life by just coming up and writing them on pieces of paper or on the table during our song. Only if you feel comfortable. In this we can practice a naming in community, but a naming just in ourselves of saying, this is what I feel right now. This is the moral stress I carry. Whether it's about any example I may have given or any number of things. We heard so many stories of moral stress this weekend. The stress of trying to be a good grandmother while also going to graduate school and fulfilling dreams. The stress over all sorts of things. I'm sure you have your own examples. If you feel comfortable in this space and you want to share what you've written with someone else, please do. That's our next step of sharing in community. But maybe you don't, and that's okay. And you can take it home, you can think about it, you can talk about it with someone if you want. So I invite you, as we sing our next song, to come forward as you feel comfortable. And bring with you a place of moral stress that you want to take that first step with, that first step of naming. And together in community, may we feel that grace and compassion with ourselves while also naming these real things in our life. So our song of response will be on page 459, Come, O Fount of Every Blessing.